The morning Donald Hargrove sold his fishing boat, the one he'd spent 11 years saving up for, the one with his wife's name painted on the hull in blue letters. Nobody in Timmins thought he had any good reason to do it. He did it for a boy nobody knew. That was the part people couldn't get past. Donald Hargrove was 61 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that men who've worked with their hands their whole lives tend to be. Not muscled so much as settled into themselves, like wood that's been left out in the weather long enough to stop warping. His hair was the color of lake ice in February, cut short and practical. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and a scar running through his left eyebrow from a chainsaw accident in 1987 that he never talked about. He'd fished the Matagami River since he was 7 years old. He'd built the boat himself over 3 winters in his garage, board by board, using a manual he'd ordered by mail and plans he'd sketched on graph paper. When he finally put it in the water for the first time, his wife Lorraine had stood on the bank and cried. Not from sentiment, she'd said, from relief that the thing actually floated. Lorraine had been gone 4 years by the time the boy showed up. His name was Callum Price. He was 16 years old and he had the look of someone who'd been outdoors for longer than was good for him. Skin roughened and reddened, hair grown past his ears in a way that wasn't stylish, just unattended. He was lean in the way malnourished kids are lean. Different from athletic lean, a kind of thinness that looks like the body has been making difficult decisions about what to keep and what to let go. He had gray eyes that were too careful for a 16-year-old. The eyes of someone who'd learned to read rooms before walking into them. He'd come into Donald's bait and tackle shop on a Thursday afternoon in early October, the kind of October afternoon in northern Ontario where the sky does something complicated and threatening with the light, and you can smell snow in the wind even if it's 3 weeks away. He'd stood near the door for a minute without saying anything, looking at the lures on the pegboard wall with the focused attention of someone who wasn't actually looking at the lures. Donald had seen that look before. "You hungry?" Donald asked. The boy's eyes moved to him, quick and assessing. Then he looked away. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was hoarse, not sick hoarse, tired hoarse. "I've got leftover chili from lunch," Donald said. "I made too much. It'll go bad if I don't get rid of it." That was a lie. Donald made exactly enough chili for exactly one man's lunch, and he ate every bite. But he said it in a flat, matter-of-fact way, the way you'd report the weather, and the boy heard it in the same tone, and after a moment he said, "Okay." His name came out slowly, in pieces, like he was deciding how much to give. Callum. Then, after a pause, Price. He ate the chili standing at the counter because Donald didn't make a production of offering him a seat. Just set the bowl down and went back to sorting hooks. And Callum seemed to prefer that, being fed without being made into a thing about feeding someone. He ate fast. He was trying not to, you could tell, but fast was what his body knew. Afterward, Donald asked him where he was from. "South of here," Callum said. "How far south? Far enough." Donald nodded like that made sense. In a way it did. He'd been 17 himself once, a long time ago, with a stepfather who had what people in those days called a temper, which was a word that did a lot of heavy lifting for things that had no polite name. He knew what south of here meant when a boy said it standing in a bait shop at the beginning of a northern Ontario winter with no coat. "You have somewhere to sleep tonight?" Donald asked. Callum's jaw moved. "I'll find something." "There's a room above the shop," Donald said. "Storage room, really. Cot in it, though. And a space heater. It works." The boy looked at him for a long moment, that careful look again, measuring the cost of accepting something. "I don't need charity," Callum said. "Good," Donald said. "Neither do I. I've been trying to clear out that storage room for 2 years. I need someone to go through the boxes up there, make 2 piles, keep and throw, and haul the tripile to dump on Saturday. That'll cover a week. After that, we'll see what else needs doing." Callum Price slept in the storage room above the bait shop that night, and the night after, and 47 nights after that. What Donald did not do during those 7 weeks was make Callum talk about where he'd come from. What Callum did not do was volunteer any of it. What they did instead was work. The storage room got cleared out by the second day, faster than Donald had pretended it would take, so they moved on to other things. The dock that needed the boards replaced before freeze-up. The back shed where Donald kept his ice fishing gear, which needed reorganizing. Callum turned out to be good with his hands, in the blunt, practical way of someone who'd been making things work since he was young enough to have no choice. He figured out problems quietly, without fanfare, and he was honest about what he didn't know, which Donald found refreshing. They ate dinner together most evenings. Donald cooked because he could and because it was something he'd kept doing after Lorraine died, refusing to let grief make him stop. He made the same things he'd always made: pot roast, baked beans, fish chowder when the weather called for it. He didn't make a ceremony of feeding Callum. He just made more than he needed and set an extra plate. His neighbor, Art Ryu, came by the shop one afternoon and looked at Callum moving lumber behind the building and said, "Who's that?" "Help," Donald said. "Where's he from?" "South of here." Art looked at Donald with the particular expression of a small-town man who has an opinion forming that he's not sure he's being invited to share. "How long's he staying?" "As long as he needs to," Donald said, and went back inside. That was not the popular answer in Timmins. People talked, the way people in small towns talk, with the good intentions of concern layered over something less comfortable, something like suspicion of the unfamiliar. Donald heard about it secondhand, the comments made at the hardware store and the Legion, the suggestion that he didn't know anything about this boy, that he was taking a risk. Donald thought about that. He thought about it in the careful, unhurried way he thought about most things. He decided he knew what he needed to know. The boat came into it in November. Donald had been thinking about selling it since the summer, when he'd taken it out for the first time since Lorraine died and realized he couldn't make himself feel the right way about it. The boat was built for two, which is something he hadn't understood until he was the only one in it. He'd come back to shore after an hour and tied it up and stood there in the late afternoon light, feeling something that he didn't have a word for. Not grief exactly, more like the particular loneliness of outliving the purpose of something you love. But Callum needed money for a bus ticket. That was the specific problem. The boy had found an apprenticeship program through a trade school in Ottawa, welding which suited him, the kind of work that required patience and precision and the ability to be alone with a task for long periods of time. He'd applied on his own, using the shop's computer in the evenings, and he'd gotten in. Donald had found out by accident, coming downstairs early one morning to find Callum sitting at the counter, reading the acceptance letter 3 times. Very still. The way you read something you're afraid might change if you look away. The program started in January. The bus ticket was $180. Callum had 63. Donald knew this because Callum told him, without asking for anything. Just told him, the same way he reported on the state of the dock boards or the level of the propane tank. As information, not as a request. Donald went home that evening and looked at the boat sitting on its trailer in the yard. He called a man he knew in Kapuskasing who'd been making noises about wanting to buy it for 2 years. He sold it for $3,000. He gave Callum $200 for the bus ticket and told him to keep the change for when he got there and needed to eat while he found his footing. Callum stood there holding the money, looking at Donald with an expression that Donald recognized as the one people wear when they're deciding whether to cry and deciding not to. "I'll pay you back," Callum said. "You'll pay it forward," Donald said. "That's how it works." Callum left on a Tuesday in January, the morning cold enough to make the windows opaque with frost. Donald drove him to the bus station and helped him get his bag from the truck bed. And that was it. That was the whole thing. A handshake, Callum's grip firm and brief, and then the boy walked into the station without looking back. Which was exactly right, Donald thought. You don't look back when you're finally moving forward. He drove home and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table for a while. He thought he'd probably never hear from the boy again. He thought that was all right. He was wrong about the first part. 28 years passed. Donald Hargrove turned 62, then 70, then 81. He sold the bait and tackle shop when his knees made standing behind the counter for 8 hours a day no longer practical. And he retired into the slow, manageable rhythms of a man living alone in northern Ontario, with a wood stove and a garden, and a small but loyal collection of library books. His eyesight was still good. His mind was still good. His hip was not, but he'd stopped expecting his hip to cooperate around the time he turned 75, and he'd made his peace with it. He had friends, a few close ones. He had his sister in Sudbury, who called every Sunday. He had the routine of his days, which he'd built carefully and kept to, because routine was what kept a person from disappearing into the absence of things they'd lost. He did not have money problems, exactly, but he had a house that was getting older in ways he couldn't keep up with, a roof that needed replacing, a foundation that had developed a crack along the north wall that the winter frost was interested in enlarging, a furnace that had started making a sound that the repairman described as worrying. He had quotes from 3 different contractors for the work that was needed, and the total sat on a piece of paper on his kitchen table like an accusation. He'd called his bank. He'd had a polite and ultimately useless conversation about a line of credit. He hadn't told anyone how serious it was. That was his nature. Private about difficulty, the way men of his generation tended to be. He hadn't heard from Callum Price in 28 years. The call came on a Wednesday morning in April. Donald was in the garden, turning soil, when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. He almost didn't answer it. "Mr. Hargrove," the voice said. "It's Callum Price." Donald straightened up slowly, one hand on his knee. A robin was doing something complicated in the birch tree at the edge of the yard. The air smelled like wet earth and the distant possibility of warmth. "Callum," Donald said, like it had been a few weeks, not 28 years. Callum's voice was a man's voice now, settled and low, with the particular cadence of someone who spent years being listened to. He said he'd been trying to find Donald for 2 months. He said he'd been thinking about him for longer than that. He said he had a company now, a structural restoration firm based out of Ottawa, 40 employees, projects all across eastern Canada, the kind of work you got called in for when other contractors couldn't figure out how to make a building sound again. He'd built it from the welding apprenticeship up, one skill at a time, one job at a time, starting from the bottom and staying there long enough to understand it completely before moving up. He said a mutual contact from Timmins had told him, without intending to, that Donald's house was having trouble. Callum didn't ask if that was true. He seemed to already know. "I'd like to come up," Callum said, "and bring some of my people, if that's all right with you." Donald looked at the robin in the birch tree. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," Callum said. "I'd like to." There was a pause. The kind of pause that 2 people take when they've gotten to the other side of something too large to name. "All right," Donald said. They arrived on a Friday morning in May, when the light in northern Ontario was doing that extraordinary thing it does in spring, coming in at a low angle through the trees and turning everything briefly golden. Donald was standing on the front porch with his coffee when he heard the sound of engines on the road. He thought it was 1 truck. Then 2. He counted as they came around the curve, 11 vehicles. Work trucks, mostly, the kind fitted out with equipment boxes and racks and the quiet authority of serious tools. He stood there holding his coffee cup and watched them pull into his yard and along the road in front of his property, parking in a line that stretched back further than he could see around the spruce trees. The cab of the first truck opened and a man got out. Callum Price was 44 years old. He was tall, taller than Donald remembered, or maybe Donald had just remembered him as a boy, and the man's height came as a surprise. He had dark hair gone gray at the temples and he was wearing a canvas work jacket and boots that had been used the way boots are meant to be used. He walked across the yard toward Donald with a stride that was direct and unhurried, and when he got to the bottom of the porch steps, he stopped and looked up. Donald looked down at him. "You brought a lot of people," Donald said. "I brought the right number," Callum said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it up. Donald came down the steps and took it and unfolded it. It was a detailed breakdown: roof replacement, foundation repair, furnace replacement, weatherproofing of the north and east walls, repair of the back deck, assessment, and repair of the electrical panel. Beside each item was a cost column that had a dash in it instead of a number. "We're not charging you," Callum said, before Donald could speak. "That's not negotiable." Donald looked at the list for a long time. Then he looked at the trucks in his yard and the men and women getting out of them, pulling on gloves, consulting clipboards, beginning to unload equipment with the efficient quiet of people who know exactly what they're doing. "This is too much," Donald said. "A fishing boat," Callum said. "A bowl of chili. A storage room." He paused. "A bus ticket." Donald said nothing. "That's not nothing," Callum said. "That's everything. When you're 16 and you're running out of places to go, a man who doesn't ask questions and doesn't make you feel small, that's everything." He looked at Donald steadily. "I built a company. I have 40 people who work for me. I have a house and kids in it, and a wife who I managed to convince to marry me against her better judgment. I've had 28 years of a life I wouldn't have gotten to without a Tuesday morning bus ticket, and a man who told me to pay it forward instead of pay it back." He gestured at the trucks. "So I'm paying it forward. This is what that looks like." Donald looked at his yard full of people who'd driven up from Ottawa, and God knows where else to fix his house. He looked at Callum Price, 16 years old in October, with gray, careful eyes, standing at a counter eating chili like he was afraid someone was going to notice. He felt something shift in his chest, the way ice shifts in April on a lake that's ready to open up. "Well," he said. His voice was not entirely under control. "I suppose if you've come all this way." Callum nodded once and turned toward the trucks and said something to the nearest crew member, and the morning got busy in the way that competent people make mornings busy, purposefully and without waste of motion, and Donald stood on his porch and watched it happen, and did not cry, exactly, though it was close. They worked for 4 days. Donald made coffee. He made lunches. He did not know what else to do, and he figured sustaining people who were working on his behalf was a reasonable contribution. He cooked the way he'd cooked for Callum 28 years ago. Practically, without ceremony, just food appearing at the right time in adequate quantities. Some of the crew ate with him in the evenings. He learned their names and something about them, the way you do when you spend several in close proximity to people with a shared purpose. There was a young woman named Avril who was doing her 4th-year apprenticeship and who had the same careful, assessing eyes that Callum had had at 16. There was a man named Douglas who'd been with Callum's company for 12 years and who talked about Callum with the matter-of-fact loyalty of someone who has decided, after long observation, that a person is worth following. There was a structural engineer named Ewan who spent an afternoon explaining to Donald, with evident pleasure, exactly what had been happening to his foundation and why, in a level of detail that Donald didn't entirely follow, but found oddly comforting because it meant someone understood the problem completely and had a plan for it. On the second evening, Callum and Donald sat on the repaired back deck after everyone else had gone to their motel. Callum had insisted on paying for that too, which Donald had stopped arguing about, and drank tea in the cool dark and listened to the spring peepers doing their thing in the swamp at the bottom of the property. "Where did you go?" Donald asked. "After Ottawa, I mean. After the apprenticeship." Callum talked for a while. He'd worked in Ottawa for 3 years, then moved to a larger firm in Toronto, then started his own company at 32 with a partner who'd since retired. He'd been through a period in his late 20s that he described briefly and without self-pity. Drinking too much, working too little, spending some time being lost in the way that boys who'd been through what he'd been through sometimes spent time being lost. He'd come out the other side of it with the help of a woman he'd met at a community rink in Ottawa, who'd had her own version of lost in her past and recognized it in him, and declined to treat either of them like that was something to be ashamed of. He had 3 kids, 14, 11, and 8. He'd taken them camping for the first time the previous summer in Algonquin Park, and the oldest had complained about everything, and the youngest had cried for 20 minutes because she'd thought she heard a bear, and the middle one had been entirely in his element. And it had been, Callum said, with a sideways smile that Donald recognized from 28 years ago, one of the best weeks of his life. "Do they know about you?" Donald asked. "Where you came from?" "The older 2 do," Callum said, in the version that's appropriate for their age. He looked out at the dark yard. "I want them to understand it eventually, not so they feel sorry for me, so they understand that you can come from very little and still become something. And so they understand." He stopped. "What? That you don't do it alone," Callum said. "That's the thing I want them to understand, that people appear. Not always, not reliably. But sometimes when you're running out of road, someone appears. And what they do for you, it's not nothing, it's everything. And you carry it." He paused. "You carry it for the rest of your life, and then you pass it on." The peepers were very loud. The sky over the spruce trees was doing something complicated and beautiful with the stars. "I thought about you," Donald said after a while. "Over the years. Wondered how you'd done." "I know," Callum said. "I should have called sooner." "You called when you were ready to," Donald said. "That's when people call." On the last morning, Callum's crew was loading equipment into the trucks in the early light. Donald stood in his yard and looked at his house, which looked like itself again. Or rather, better than it had looked in years. The roof clean and new, the north wall solid, the deck boards straight and sealed. It looked, he thought, like a house that intended to keep standing. Callum came to find him. "There's one more thing," he said. He led Donald around to the back of the last truck and opened the cargo box. Inside was a boat, not a big one, not fancy. A 14-foot aluminum flat bottom with a small outboard, the kind of boat you take on a river when you want to fish without making a production of it. "It's not the one you sold," Callum said. "I know that, but it's a good boat." Donald looked at it for a long time. "I painted the name on the hull," Callum said. Donald walked around to the side of the boat and crouched down despite his hip's opinion on the matter. "Lorraine," it said, in blue letters. He stayed crouched there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he stood up and looked at Callum Price, 44 years old, who had gray at his temples and a company with 40 people in it, and 3 kids and a week in Algonquin with a bear alarm, and who was standing in Donald's backyard in the early morning light, looking almost exactly the way he'd looked at 16, standing at the counter in the bait shop with his careful, measuring eyes. "Thank you," Donald said. "Thank you," Callum said. They shook hands. It lasted a moment longer than a handshake usually does. The trucks pulled out one by one and drove back south, and Donald stood in his yard until the sound of the engines faded, and there was nothing left but the sound of the river somewhere in the trees and the birds, starting up their morning argument. He went inside and made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table where the contractor quotes had been, and which was now bare and clean. He thought about a boy eating chili at a counter. He thought about a boat with a woman's name on the side, and the way the light had hit the water the first time he'd put it in. He thought about what it meant to pass something on. Not to hand it over and be done with it, but to set it in motion, to trust that it would travel further than you could see. He thought the world was full of that, quietly, under the surface of things. People carrying what other people had given them, arriving when the time was right, with trucks and tools and a painted name, paying forward what they couldn't pay back. He drank his coffee. Outside, the river was moving the way rivers always move, without memory of what they'd carried before, without hurry about what they'd carry next, just moving, as rivers do, reliably, and without asking anything of anyone. And if you took a boat out on it, a certain kind of morning, in the right light, you might almost think the water was trying to tell you something. That there are seasons to a life, same as to a country that knows winter the way this one does. That what you plant in November, in the cold and dark, sometimes comes back to you in May. Sometimes it comes back with 40 trucks. Sometimes it comes back with a name painted in blue on the hull of a boat, sitting in your yard in the early light, waiting for you to take it out.